What we saw in the last segment on surplus value and the crisis of overproduction is that the contradictions of capitalism, according to Marx, originate in the class relationship, right, between capitalists and workers, between the nature of that relationship. That workers are exploited in the process of production. The form that that exploitation takes is the production of surplus value, which leads to the crisis of overproduction. So the point that I'm trying to emphasize here is the idea that the contradictions of capitalism originate in the class system. And so we can continue with that idea about the contradictions of capitalism according to Marx, and what might lead to the downfall of capitalism. That those things originate, again, in the nature of the dynamics of class in a capitalist society. So, what we're going to start getting into here is something about the politics of class that Marx is talking about. And so we're going to need to go back, right, to this notion of class consciousness that we talked about a little bit ago. Okay, now the first thing I think, even before we do that, is we need to say something about the nature, right, or the consequences of exploitation in a capitalist society. Capitalism is based on the production of surplus value and the maximizing of the production of surplus value. So, if I want to get surplus value out of my workers, how can I do that? How can I get my workers to produce more surplus value? Because surplus value is potential profit. All right. So one way that I can increase the level, right, of surplus value that my workers produce is simply by extending the workday, right, without changing anything else. I can extend the workday. So instead of having them work for 10 hours a day, I can make them work for 12 hours a day, or I can make them work for 15 hours a day. Now, you see where this maybe is leading, is that there are limits to that. There are limits to the extension of the workday, right, as a way to produce more surplus value. And the limits are that there are only 24 hours in a day. The other limit is that, if my workers were working 24 hours a day, um, they wouldn't be able to survive that, right? Because workers need time, right, to reproduce or recreate their ability to work. They need to eat, they need to rest, right, so they can come back to the factory, so they can return to the factory every day. All right, so if there are limits to the increase of surplus value through the extension of the workday, then what's another way that I can increase the level of surplus value? It would be to increase the rate at which they produce surplus value, right? To get them to work faster. And the way I get them to work faster is through those technological innovations that I was talking about before. The revolutionizing of the instruments of production, as Marx put it. So now we're going to develop the assembly line, and we're going to mechanize the process. We're going to mechanize the production process. That way we can increase the pace of work so that within the course of any given workday, we can produce higher rates of surplus value. Okay, so that idea of revolutionizing the instruments of production is crucial, right, to capitalism, right? Crucial to the necessity of constantly increasing the rate of surplus value. Now, here's the thing, that has consequences. And now Marx is talking about the nature of work under capitalism. And this is where we get into his notion of alienation, okay, the concept of alienation. Now that word, alienation, what does it mean? Literally, what it means is separation from. People are separated from something. Workers are separated from something, right? Marx also, sometimes this word gets translated as estrangement, right? They become strangers to something. Again, they become separated from something. So, what is it they're becoming separated from? Well, here we have to go. We go to Marx, not the economist, right, but Marx, the philosopher. And so, when Marx talked about estrangement, when he talked about alienation, the thing he said was that in the process of production, workers are alienated from their species being. This is a translation of a German word, right? Their species being. Okay, so I paused it so I could get up and I don't know if you can read that on the board there. There we go. But it's alienation from species being. So it's species with a hyphen and being. And, what Marx was basically talking about again is not necessarily human nature, right? Because species being is not located in the human organism. It's not located in the individual. Rather, it's something that connects us, right? So he's not talking about human nature the way maybe Hobbes talked about human nature, that it's just built into us to be a certain way. Rather, he talks about species being as something that we share, and he's really talking about the potential, right, of humanity. Like I said, this is more Marx, the philosopher, than Marx, the economist at this point. When he says that we are alienated from our species being, maybe another way to think about it is just simply that we're dehumanized. There's something about the capitalist process of work that is dehumanizing, separates us from something essentially human in quality. And what that would be like our need to be creative and our need to be expressive and our need to find satisfaction in what we do and all those kinds of things. And the nature of capitalist work, according to Marx, alienates us from that. So if we, think about uh, what we said about how surplus value is increased through, um, you know, in a relative sense by making workers work faster and subjecting them to machines and so on. That process of work is dehumanizing. So let's think about different ways, right, in which humans under capitalism, workers under capitalism, are alienated. One way, we said, when we were describing wage labor, we said workers are separated from the means of production, right? So workers are alienated, they're separated from the means of production. They no longer have control over their tools, right? They no longer have control over these very basic things, right, that they need to create their own life. They don't own them anymore. They don't control them anymore. They're controlled by somebody else. And so since they're controlled by somebody else, now they are subjected, right, to them. The work becomes highly routinized, right? Workers don't have control over the work process anymore. They don't control the pace, right, at which they work. The command over work passes to somebody else besides the actual direct producer. So Marx talks about how workers are subjected to machinery, right? He says they become treated, right, as mere extensions of machines. He says something like where once the worker controlled the tool, now it appears that the tool controls the worker. All right, so they're mere extensions of machines, and besides that, they are expendable. Right? Workers in a capitalist society are expendable. So they're not treated as people. They're not treated as human beings. They're treated as mere factors of production, right? Mere factors of accounting. So, you know, uh, you are viewed by your employer in terms of cost saving, right? So, um, you have a job for as long as, or you have a job until that time comes when we can come up with a machine to replace you. So workers are expendable, they're replaceable. Okay. Now, other ways in which workers are they're alienated from the means of production. They're treated as objects. They're treated as mere factors of production. They are expendable. They are alienated from control over the product that they produce. They don't own it anymore. That surplus value that they produced is not something they own anymore, right? Um, so they're alienated from the final product of their work, right? Their work, because it's so fragmented, right? Because now you are simply performing one operation within an overall work process, the work becomes more or less meaningless, right? Workers don't necessarily understand their connection, right, to the entire process, you know. I remember a quote from a worker once who said, I enjoy baking, right? I love to bake. But if I had a job where all I did was crack eggs in a bowl for 8 hours a day, right, that would be meaningless. That would feel like just meaningless work. So the work becomes meaningless. They're separated from control over the process. They're separated from control over the final product. And finally, they're separated from each other, right? They're separated from each other. Workers are separated or alienated from each other because now they are placed into competition with each other, right? And they're not cooperation, but competition with each other. They're competing, you know, for jobs. They're competing. Workers are competing with each other for wages, right? Does everybody get that? You know, so these are, for Marx, alienation is really the consequences of capitalist production and consequences of the manner in which workers are exploited, right, in a capitalist society, according to Marx. So, how does this relate to to the politics, right, of class? Well, it goes back to that idea of class consciousness, right? Marx said that with all that we just said about alienation, Marx said that one of the things that capitalism does, okay, I got to pause here for a second, so don't go away. Okay, so I'm back. So what we're talking about now in terms of the politics of class is the potential for the working class to develop a class consciousness, right? A unified class consciousness. Any class society, not just capitalism, but I think we said this, more toward the beginning. Any class society, according to Marx, means that the broad contours of political interest in that society are going to be determined by class arrangements, right? People's position within the class system. So capitalists have interests, right? Political interests as capitalists. They want to maintain the system under which they are privileged, right? They want to maintain the conditions that promote the market, and they want to maintain their relationship of wage labor to the working class, because wage labor creates surplus value, which gets converted into profit. So they want to maintain that system, right? Just like slave owners want to maintain the institution of slavery because they're privileged under it, right? Workers would have in their historical interest the abolition of the system under which they are exploited. Okay, so that would be their political interest. Okay, so that sort of defines why there is always class conflict in a capitalist society. And they're, you know, the working class always, according to Marx, has the potential, right, to develop a unified uh, class consciousness, right, where they would get together and organize for their to defend their own interests, up to and including um, revolution, right, a socialist revolution. And Marx talked about, well, maybe different stages along the way, right, of workers becoming organized. So maybe the first step would be, you know, the organization of trade unions, and maybe another step would be the organization of workers' political parties, right? And maybe, you know, strikes, and maybe eventually, perhaps, a unification of the working class into a radicalized class, right, who are now going to go fight uh, to defend their own interests. Okay. Everybody understand that? Okay. There's a quote in Marx, this is the one I was digging for before, where he says, as bourgeois industries expand and increase their own capital, the ranks of the proletariat swell as other classes of society, the artisans and small business owners, cannot compete with bourgeois capitalists. Additionally, the development of bourgeois industries causes a proportional deterioration in the condition of the proletariat, right? The development of bourgeois industries causes a proportional deterioration in the condition of the proletariat. Things get worse for them. This deterioration can be slowed but not stopped, creates within the proletariat a revolutionary element which will eventually destroy their bourgeois oppressors. Okay, this is from the manifesto. As Marx says, right, what the bourgeoisie therefore produces above all is its own grave diggers. That's what I want to focus on right there. Okay, what the bourgeoisie produces is its own grave diggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. All right, so capitalism produces its own gravediggers. So what did he mean by that? Again, he meant capitalism produces the conditions under which the working class can become a class-conscious revolutionary class. Okay, when the conditions of their exploitation become so apparent, right, that they then want to do something about them. Okay. So why does that happen? All right. Well, we got to go back to our discussion of class. We said that in a capitalist society, there are, you know, that relationship between capitalists and workers is the relationship that defines capitalism as capitalism. But there are other classes possible. So I want to get this. Remember this from before, right? Here we go. It's our basic defining relationship of capitalism. But there are other classes, okay? And one of the other classes that exists in a capitalist society is a middle class. There's a middle class, okay? And that middle class is called the petty bourgeoisie. Okay, the petty bourgeoisie. Right, the petty bourgeoisie, the little capitalist class. Now, who are they? Right? Who are they? Well, they are, in Marx's day, right, the middle class was the class of the owners of small businesses, right, and independent artisans and independent craftsmen, right, and independent professionals, doctors and lawyers and so on. And these, this middle class, they're in the middle, right, for Marx, because they have a foot, right, on each side of the line. So, in other words, what they have something in common with capitalists. What they have in common with capitalists is that they own some capital. They own some means of production. Like you want to think here about maybe a small family business, right? Shopkeepers, mom and pop, they own a store, okay? Uh, right? And maybe what they also have in common with capitalists is they may employ to some extent some wage labor, right? So mom and pop have a store, they own the store, and they hire a stock boy, right? Or something, okay? Or a plumber hires, who has his own plumbing business, hires some assistants, okay? But you get that. So that's one thing they have in common with the capitalists. Now, what they have in common with the working class is that they work, right? In other words, that they own these means of production, but they rely on their own labor to work that up, okay, to work that capital, okay. So they work for a living, right? They don't just simply own something; they work for a living too. So there you go. So you got these small, like shopkeepers, owners of restaurants, right? Owners of pubs, bars, right? Petty, smaller, independent professionals, doctors, lawyers. They have their own they have their own practice, right? And they work every day, right, at it. Now, what Marx will say is that this middle class that exists here serves as a kind of a buffer, right, between the working class and the capitalist class. Okay, so as long as there's a big middle class, it doesn't look like the the gap, right, between the capitalist class and the working class is so extreme, right? Uh, so if I'm at the bottom and I look up and I see, well, there's a middle class like right above me. Okay. But if we take that middle class away, right, and I look up, now I'm looking all the way up, right, to the wealthiest and most privileged capitalists. And now the inequality, the fundamental injustice of the class system becomes readily apparent to me. Okay. And so, Marx said again, right, capitalism creates its own grave diggers. Well, one way it does that is because the middle class, right, that class of independent shopkeepers and so on, they can't compete, right? Time goes on and they can't compete with bigger units of capital. Okay, they can't compete with bigger units of capital. And so they are going to be driven out of the market. They're going to be driven away. And they're going to fall, right? A lot of them are going to fall into the working class. So the ranks of the working class will swell, right? And meanwhile, the vast inequality between the capitalist class and the working class will become more readily apparent. That buffer will be gone. And that potentially, right, can radicalize, first of all, by increasing the size of the working class, but also by radicalizing them, okay? Everybody, you follow that there, right? So the disappearance of the middle class could lead to the creation of a class-conscious working class, okay? Everybody all right with that? Maybe the best thing we could say about that today, maybe one of the comparisons we could make today would be how, traditionally you had like, the small neighborhood or community hardware store that is being driven out of business by the big box stores like Lowe's and Home Depot, right? Or how independently owned businesses, downtown businesses, are driven out of the market by companies like Walmart. Something that's we're talking about today. We talked today about the shrinking of the middle class and those kinds of things. So There might be some relevance there for Marx. He might have been onto something. All right, I may come back to that as a little footnote toward the end. All right. Now, there are other things that could lead to the radicalization of the working class in Marx's analysis of class. One of them is simply the conditions of capitalist labor, right? The conditions of capitalist production. Because what capitalism does, because it's centered, because capitalist production takes place in a factory, right? The workers come to it, okay? There, let's say something about Fred Engels. Okay, Fred Engels wrote "Condition of the Working Class" in England, and one of the things that Engels said was that every factory is a potential town. So he was saying that one of the things that capitalism does is it leads to urbanization. Okay, so now you have workers, right, who are now gathered together all in one place, and they can see very readily how they share a common condition, and that can promote working class consciousness. Okay, not not to mention that capitalism also leads to the rise of things like today we'd call it the media, right? But back then it would have been the press, right? Journalism and so on, and the ready availability of information. Today we have the internet, right? And we can communicate with each other instantly over great distances. But then it was the press, right? It was the penny press. So people had access to newspapers, and they had access to journals and all kinds of literature, right? And so they could get news and they could communicate with each other, and that creates the potential for the working class to become a radicalized class. That Marx compared the modern proletariat to the peasantry of the past, and one of the things he said about the peasantry was that the peasantry does not have the potential. They're a class in itself. Structurally, they're a class. They have a relationship to means of production. They have a common relationship to land, but they can't become, or it would be very difficult for them to become, a class for itself, right? A class conscious class. And that's basically because of their isolation, right? They're isolated in these small communities in the countryside that are sort of disconnected from each other. Okay, so there you go. So the conditions of capitalism itself, the nature of exploitation under capitalism, the alienation, the dehumanization of the capitalist work process, the conditions of factory work, and so on. The disappearance of the middle class, the gradual disappearance of the middle class. All of these things could potentially lead to a politically motivated working class that would then offer resistance, right, to the system. Okay, not to mention that capitalism is prone to crises. It's unstable. So we get that crisis of overproduction, and when we get the crisis of overproduction, we get factories closing, and we get workers laid off, and that just magnifies the dissatisfaction. Okay, so what counteracts that, right? Within the context of capitalism, what counteracts that? Now we got to talk about social control. How does capitalism maintain itself? How does capitalism prevent that from happening? Capitalists do not want workers to become class conscious, right? So how do they prevent that? Or how is it prevented? Well, first of all, talk about the state. Okay, the state, right? Marx said, right? When you get class society, you get states, right? You get states. And the state represents, generally speaking, the interests of the privileged class. Okay. So that the state is a means, an apparatus through which one class oppresses another. In particular, in the Communist Manifesto, he said the executive of the modern state, right? The modern state is nothing more than a committee for managing the common affairs of the entire bourgeoisie. So what he was saying here was that the state becomes this organization of the political interests of the capitalist class. Okay, and so now they can use, the capitalist class can call upon the police power, right, of the state to maintain control. Okay, so if workers get dissatisfied and they're trying to organize, think about it like this. Think about the Homestead strike in 1892. Workers organizing to defend their interests and go on strike, and now the company can call out the militia. Right? The company can call upon the state to send out the militia to put the strike down, right, on behalf of the owners of the factory. So the coercive nature of the state, right, the ability of capitalists to call upon the police power of the state. So coercion is one way, right, to maintain order, to maintain the system. What's another way, right, that they could do this? Well, the nature of wage labor itself is controlling, right? Because if my livelihood depends on me having a job and making a wage, and the quality of my life depends on that, then I might be reluctant, right, to rock the boat. Okay, we might be reluctant, right, to rock the boat. So the wage labor system itself, right? Remember, Weber talking about workers working under compulsion of the whip of hunger, right? So the wage labor system itself, because I'm not free from need and I rely on my wage, for my livelihood, that might motivate me not to make waves. All right. Now another way is through the generation of ideologies. Okay, the generation of ideologies of rationalizations of the system. Instead of the workers creating, or the workers being able to establish a class consciousness, what Marx said that was what was in the interest of the capitalist class is that for the workers to have a false consciousness. So we get this other concept from Marx, which is the concept of false consciousness.